Hello, my name is Scott Johnson, and I'm a missionary with Alongside Ministries International, and I'm preparing to serve with the Czech Evangelical Alliance in Prague, Czech Republic. First of all, thank you for giving me a chance to share with you some of my story about how God has been leading me to this new opportunity. Let me start off by sharing a bit about Alongside Ministries. This ministry was started in the late 1970s in order to mobilize missionaries for work in Europe. Alongside's goal is to build partnerships with European churches, ministries, and equip global workers to work alongside European workers, hence the name Alongside Ministries. Everyone benefits when churches and Christians relate across national and cultural lines. Of course, cross-cultural relationships have been part of the DNA of the church since the very beginning. I'm convinced that church growth and a dedication to global and cross-cultural missions go hand in hand. As a small organization, we value the flexibility and creativity needed to face the unique challenges of the European mission field. So, why Europe? Europe hasn't traditionally been thought of as a mission field. After all, Europe used to be the place where most of the missionaries came from. Christianity was the dominant cultural force on this continent from the earliest days of Christianity. Many cross-cultural mission organizations have focused their attention on the global south, that is, the developing world in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And the fruits of these efforts are obvious. Today, 2/3 of all Christians worldwide are now located in the global south, and it continues to grow. Now, I'm not suggesting that the work there is done, but it is interesting to note that the concentration of Christians in the global south is increasing, while it is steadily decreasing in the Western nations. Europe in particular is aggressively post-Christian. Despite its rich Christian heritage, today there are very few vibrant, robust churches who are actively proclaiming the good news of Jesus Christ. Alongside Ministry serves in the regions of Europe that have been among the most antagonistic to the gospel. Places like France, Estonia, Albania, and of course the Czech Republic, which is the most secular, non-religious nation in the world. So, why the Czech Republic? It's a beautiful country with a rich culture. The arts, music, science, industry, these are all things that the Czechs have prided themselves in for centuries, and with good reason. And while today it tops the list of the most secular nations in the world, it has not always been this way. The Czech lands were at the heart of the Christian Reformation, a full century before Martin Luther. A man named Jan Hus was a 14th century Czech theologian and reformer, and he laid much of the foundation that Luther would continue to build on. Then in the 18th century, a small group of Czech Moravian refugees began a prayer watch that would continue without interruption 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for 100 years. And this became the foundation for the modern missions movement. But concurrent with all of this Christian reformation and renewal were forces that were strongly opposed to it. The land that is now the Czech Republic was once ruled by the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Roman Catholic Church was at the time an oppressive arm of the powers that be. So, as a Czech national identity emerged, people took a dim view of the church and on religion in general. So, like much of Europe, the Czechs pursued intellectualism and secularism as their national philosophy. Then the communist rule of Czechoslovakia severely restricted religion altogether, and this continued until 1989 when what's known as the Velvet Revolution brought down the communist dictatorship and introduced a democratic system of government. Even though freedom of religion was guaranteed, by this time the public viewed religion as mostly irrelevant. And today the number of people in the Czech Republic who identify as evangelicals is a tiny fraction of the overall population, about 1/3 of 1%. Even the most secular regions of the United States are 20 to 30 times that amount. But things are changing. The younger generations who came of age after the fall of the communist dictatorship are challenging the cultural atheism that they inherited from their parents and grandparents. And they're curious about religion and open to dialogue about matters of faith and spirituality. So there's no better time than the present to make an impact on the spiritual life of the Czech Republic. The Czech Evangelical Alliance is one of Alongside Ministries' long-standing European partners. It was founded just 2 years after the Velvet Revolution. And today the Alliance connects 9 different denominations and a multitude of congregations, ministries, and parachurch organizations across the Czech Republic and advocates for the gospel in the public square. Its mission is to equip churches, train leaders, and foster unity and cooperation among Christians. Okay, so we've looked at why Europe and why the Czech Republic, but here's a question that really haunts me. Why me? What does someone like me have to offer a mission field like the Czech Republic? Well, I guess that remains to be seen, but as I began exploring ministry options, the first question that ministry leaders asked me wasn't so much what I had to offer, but rather, why on earth do you want to come to the Czech Republic? After all, the church there is tiny and fractured and struggling and stretched thin. And their second question was, how soon can you get here? There's not a shortage of things to do, but there is a shortage of people to do them. But God is the one who does the work, of course, and he's not limited by our limitations, and he delights in using the small and foolish things of this world to accomplish his purposes, so I fit that requirement well enough. The bottom line is that the fields are white and the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. So these ministries are continually praying to the Lord of the harvest to send workers into the field. My specific role will be in the area of communications, and it just so happens that this is what I've been doing for the past quarter century. My vision is to work alongside the Evangelical Alliance to help develop and grow communication and multimedia strategies to equip the churches and share the gospel in the Czech Republic and even beyond. There's also a huge need for discipleship and spiritual formation, especially among young adults, and to create spaces where their questions and struggles can be addressed with honesty and integrity. And this has also been a growing burden of mine. But to answer the first question that they asked me, why do I want to go to the Czech Republic? Put simply, I have been seized by the power of a great affection. I long for Christ to be made known among the Czech people, and I want to be a part of what God is doing there. It really is as simple as that. None of this was at all on my radar at the beginning of last year. God just stirred something in me. It seized me. So, how did all this come about for me? As I've been reflecting on the story of my journey, it's becoming clear that God has been orchestrating things from the very beginning. So if you'll bear with me, a little backstory, I'll try to connect a few dots. So to go back to the very beginning, I was born in Richland, Washington, as an only child to very supportive parents who raised me in the Christian faith. And they also instilled in me a passion for travel, even from a young age. By the time I graduated from high school, they'd hauled me around 4 different continents. And today I consider this among the best gifts they could have given me. It gave me a love of exploring the world, but it also paved a way for a vision for global missions. And not only this, but missions was a big part of the identity of my home church of Westside. Visiting missionaries would come traipsing through quite regularly, so I always had this understanding that our church was connected to a much bigger world outside our little community. When I was in high school, I went on a short-term mission trip to Mexico, and it was there that I began to sense that God was calling me to cross-cultural missions. I even signed this commitment card with all the naive sincerity of a 16-year-old, and then mostly forgot about it for a while. But a couple of years later, while at a summer camp, God stood in my way and called my bluff. One day I was out walking alone and suddenly was just stopped dead in my tracks by a powerful thought that I was sure didn't come from inside of me. And it was that I was not to pursue medicine, which had been my dream since childhood, but that I would be going to Latin America to work with youth. It was just this sudden knowing. And even so, I had to test it, and so I sought out trusted mentors to help me sort it out. But God seemed to confirm that call, both internally and externally, at just about every turn. So over the next few months, it just became the trajectory of my life. I finished my studies, and then in 1991, I packed up and moved to Costa Rica to serve with the Latin America mission. And I spent 4 years there with an organization called Roble Alto, working with youth at risk. I worked as a liaison between the kids and the sponsorship program, and this drew me into various fields of communication, and I began to catch a vision for using multimedia in ministry and felt compelled to get some more education. I returned to the United States, got my master's degree in communications, and in 2001 I moved to Miami to work with the media department of the Latin America mission. And over the next couple of years, I traveled throughout Latin America, visiting missionaries, capturing their stories, and sharing them with others. Then a new opportunity came up. In 2003, I was invited to move to this little town of Brigham City, Utah, to help start a media ministry from the ground up in order to reach the Latter-day Saint community. While there, my production skills were stretched beyond what I would have ever imagined, and even got a chance to spend about 6 months in Jerusalem. I also got a thorough education on the religion and culture of the Latter-day Saints. But it had some hard lessons too, and we went through some difficult periods of significant upheaval. But overall, my time at the ministry in Utah gained me a much deeper understanding of the unshakable trustworthiness of God, which came in handy when my ministry took a very different turn. In 2018, my parents' health had begun to fail, and it became necessary for me to return to Richland to accompany them. As difficult as it was a privilege to be able to do this while continuing my work for the ministry in Utah remotely. My father passed away in 2019, followed by my mother almost 2 years later. So those are some difficult years as I navigated the grief of losing both my parents in the midst of the isolation of the COVID pandemic. And I wrestled with all the big questions. What am I supposed to do with my life now? Who even am I? Do I have anything worthwhile left to offer? And I wasn't finding any satisfactory answers, and I found myself feeling very stuck and discouraged. After the pandemic restrictions lessened, I tried to kickstart new media projects, but all my efforts fell flat, and I found myself feeling useless and obsolete. And I kept busy enough with administrative tasks, but kept wondering, is this it? Has all the best juice been squeezed out of me? I was at this awkward age, not ready to retire, but feeling too old for any major pivots in my career. And well-meaning people would frequently ask, "So, what are your plans now?" And I would just groan inside. I mean, I had good people around me, but I was feeling more and more despondent and hopeless, really. And so this is where I was mentally in early 2023 when I was presented with an opportunity to go to Europe. By this time, I figured I would probably never use my passport again, and even wondered if I'd even get on a plane again. I didn't really want to go on this trip. Part of me knew that it would be good for me in a kick in the pants sort of way, but mostly I feared it was just a foolish and futile attempt to shake me out of these doldrums. The first component of the trip would be a spiritual pilgrimage. We'd be exploring God's goodness through wine and food and art and beauty. And as great as that should have sounded, the fact that I didn't really want to take that trip made me more aware that there really was something wrong inside of me. So I went. I got on a plane and used my passport and went to Europe. And the weird thing is, before I left, I had to act excited about it. I mean, what else was I supposed to say? Oh, what a nightmare. I have to go to this beautiful village in France and drink world-class wines. I mean, in reality, I was just hoping that it would not totally undo me. And it did. It truly ended up being my undoing. It undid so many things that needed to be undone. God really met me there in ways that were completely unexpected. I felt like he was making cracks in the cement layer that had crusted up all over me. And things started to leak out and things started to leak in, and it was painful and beautiful all at once. And the final component of this jaunt through Europe was a short-term mission trip to the Czech Republic through my home church of Westside. I joined the team, but with some reluctance. The Czech Republic had never been on my bucket list. Besides, we were going to be working with teenagers at this English camp, and these things were definitely not in my wheelhouse. So I was even more apprehensive about this chapter of the trip. And by the time I got on the flight to Prague, I had already had a rough day. It was sad to say goodbye to the fellow pilgrims that I'd bonded with over the previous week, and getting to the Frankfurt airport to catch my flight was a miserable experience. So by the time I got on the plane, I was just done. I wasn't in any mood to navigate a new city and a new country. So I'm looking out the window as we come in for a landing. I think I'm just trying to count how many countries this now makes for me. But suddenly, out of the blue, I was interrupted by this clear voice inside my head, much like back when I was 18. But it was just 2 words: welcome home. It wasn't audible, but I remember looking around me like I'd actually heard something. And as I made my way out of the plane, I remember praying, okay, God, if that was you, and I'm not saying I think it was, you're going to have to give me more to go on. Frankly, I was hoping it was just an intrusive thought, because I had no intention of moving anywhere, let alone overseas, let alone to a country still cleaning up after the Iron Curtain days. But over the next few days, I couldn't shake it. I found myself wandering around Prague thinking, is this going to be familiar to me someday? Could I actually live here? Am I going to be riding up this metro escalator every morning? And the weird thing is, it wasn't a sense of dread or excitement. It was just this quiet voice that kept dogging me, this sense that my relationship with this place was not going to be as a casual visitor. But I set all that aside to go on this English camp with our mission team, and which, as I said before, I was kind of apprehensive about, and I was just praying that I would survive the week intact. Well, just when I thought I was undone enough, I got undone some more. That whole experience could fill another presentation, but the upshot is that I had some really moving encounters with the campers and the leaders there that shook me to my core. And suddenly the Czech Republic wasn't just a country in Central Europe, but it was a place where people I knew and cared about were striving to be faithful in a very hostile environment. So even as all this was stirring in me, I still had no idea what it actually had to do with me. Shortly before returning to the States, one of our missionary contacts approached me and said, "Now, you do multimedia work, right?" And I'm like, "Yeah, why?" And then he says, "Hey, no pressure," and goes on to say that there was an urgent need for people with those skills in the ministries that he was involved with. I could feel the blood draining from my head, and I thought to myself, oh boy, my life is about to get more complicated, isn't it? So when I returned to the United States, I felt pretty much like everything inside of me had been dismantled. A couple days after I got back, I was cleaning a shelf in the den and came across that missions commitment card that I'd signed, as it turns out, exactly 40 years ago, like almost to the day. So that caught my attention, and I'm reflecting on that, and I'm remembering how God held me to it all those years ago. And so I thought, yeah, I know, I'd fulfilled that commitment. I'd served overseas, but, that season of life is long past. So I'm starting to shove it back where I found it. It's a nice little souvenir of the past. But then something inside of me holds back and says, not so fast. And I was suddenly struck by how things were coming full circle. My first high school mission trip, now this last one 40 years later, now finding the card on that particular day, and I'm thinking, God, are you still holding me to this? The idea of a new adventure did entice me a little, but it terrified me a lot. So, like back when I was 18, I started to ask for some help in discerning whether or not the whole notion of packing up and moving to the Czech Republic was just an insane fool's errand, or something that God might actually be calling me to. I began corresponding with that missionary in Prague, and eventually had a Zoom meeting with some of his colleagues, and made some inquiries with Alongside Ministry, since I knew some of the people on the board. And then I came across a conference posted on Facebook for singles and cross-cultural missions that would be held a few weeks later in Spain. And the subject matter intrigued me because I'd had lots of discussions with other single missionaries about these issues. So I quickly went from, that's interesting, to, I kind of think I need to do this. And I also knew that I wasn't going to get any closure about whether God was calling me to the Czech Republic or not until I'd gone back there and spent some time exploring options in person. So I figured maybe I could kill two birds with one stone, go to the conference in Spain and then on to Prague to hopefully gain some more clarity about what God had in mind. So I registered for the conference, scrambled up some contacts and meetings in Prague, and booked my tickets, and away I went. The conference in Spain was transformative in ways I never saw coming. I'd initially gone because the subject matter interested me, but I didn't expect to be so deeply challenged and encouraged. One of the big questions that I had been grappling with in all of this was, do I still have it in me to do this? Am I still fit for overseas missions? Is this even something I want to do? When I showed up at the conference, I felt like an imposter. I was surrounded by all these missionaries who were actively serving all over the world, and I had just been a homebody for the past few years, and I was decades removed from my life in overseas missions. But as I spent time with these other missionaries, I began to feel that fire and excitement for world missions stir up in me again. So from there, I spent about 10 days in Prague. I had several meetings with people from several ministries, and in between, I spent some quiet time praying and reflecting. And Prague does have hundreds of empty churches and a bunch of old cemeteries, which are ideal places when you're feeling introspective and needing some space to think and pray. And I'd had some really good meetings, but one of the things that I wanted to return to the United States with was more clarity about what God was calling me to do. And I couldn't sort out these conflicting feelings from any sense of God's call. So one day, toward the end of my time there, I was wandering around the cemetery and just kind of pleading with God for some kind of word or sign or lightning bolt or something, Do you want me to do this or not? This would not be my first rodeo living overseas, so I knew that the life of a foreigner is hard, especially those first few years when you're overwhelmed by culture shock and language and isolation. Giving up the security of friends and home and community and familiarity, those aren't small things. So I was telling God, if you're not behind this, then I don't want anything to do with it. So as I wandered around the cemetery, kind of grinding my teeth in frustration, what came to me was a very quiet whisper, but it had all of the clarity that I was looking for. God seemed to be saying to me in that moment, "Look, Scott, the only thing I'm calling you to do is to build your life in me. You don't have to come here to do that. You can go back to Richland and your familiar life and your familiar community. I'll still be with you. As for Europe, I'm going to do what I'm going to do with or without you. But why don't you come with me on this adventure here in the Czech Republic, and let's see what we can do?" And so it dawned on me that I wasn't so much getting marching orders from my commanding officer, I was getting an invitation from my friend. And that reframed everything. And so the question became not so much, did God want me in the Czech Republic or not, but rather, if he really was calling me to build my life in him, then how best would that happen? Would it be in the comforts of my familiar surroundings, or was it going to be in a place where I would constantly be faced with my complete and utter dependence on him for everything? So a couple days later, I think it was my last full day in Prague, or maybe the day before, I was in a cafe on a really cold day, trying to warm up with a hot drink. I had my phone out, and I was typing some thoughts and reflections on all this when the cafe's music system started playing the U2 song, With or Without You. And I knew that God was telling me that it was time to fish or cut bait. What's it going to be, with or without you? So I took a deep breath and I told him, all right, I'm in. Here am I. And from that moment, all of the frustration and hand-wringing, the should I or shouldn't I of the past few months just started to dissipate. And I could almost physically feel it draining out of me. And that deep peace just settled over me. So once I got back home, I began the process of applying with Alongside Ministries. And the next few months were full of lots of calls and discussions and interviews. I was officially accepted as an alongsider in the spring, and then began the process of figuring out how all of this was going to happen. And this past summer, I made another trip to the Czech Republic, to the English camp with a small team from my church, and also attended an organization-wide gathering of Alongside Ministries right after. And this is where I felt like I was truly inducted into the Alongside community. So now that I'm back, the gravity of what is ahead is beginning to settle on me. And as I look at all that has to be done between now and when I relocate for good to the Czech Republic, my current target departure date is May 1st of 2025. It's a soft target because there's a lot of moving parts that have to come together in order to make this happen, but it's what we're aiming for at this point. The first big task is partnership development. The reality is, I can't do this alone. First and foremost, I need a team of people who are committed to praying for me on a regular basis and who are willing to communicate with me about prayer needs and so forth. And this is not a casual request. I don't make it lightly. Prayer is work and time and effort, but please consider being on my prayer team. I also need people who are called to partner with me in financial support. As of this recording, in order to be able to leave for the Czech Republic, I need to increase my support by about $2,000 per month. And this might seem like a lot, but no gift is small in the hands of a big God. So, again, I would invite you to pray about whether God might be calling you to be either one of my prayer supporters or financial supporters, or maybe even both. Just ask God about it. And by all means, feel free to get in touch with me if you have any questions at all about what that would entail. I'd love to talk with you about it. So these next months leading up to my departure will be busy ones, and I ask for your prayers. Besides partnership development, I also need to apply for my visa, to get my house ready for rent, which is the current plan, and secure language school. The first year I'm in the Czech Republic, I will be spending with intensive Czech language and cultural training. And Czech is a very difficult language for English speakers to master, so please pray for me in that process of language acquisition. And people are asking how long I plan to be in the Czech Republic, and the simple answer is, as long as God would have me here. I'm not going with an end date in mind. All of our times are in God's hands, and so I'll live there until God tells me to return to the States or go somewhere else. Finally, to wrap up, I just want to share a couple of things that I've been chewing on as I've been preparing my heart for this big change, a new challenge. When I was in the Czech Republic this summer, I knocked off something that's been on my bucket list for years, and that was to visit the UNESCO World Heritage Site of the Sedlec Ossuary in Kutná Hora. It's about an hour outside of Prague. It's a small chapel that houses the bones of some 50,000 people from medieval times in an underground crypt. As the crypt was becoming crowded, the bones were arranged into these stunning works of art, these intricate designs, chandeliers, and so forth. So I finally got there, and it was fascinating. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. On one hand, it was beautiful in its own way and artistic, and on the other hand, it was really macabre. But it also struck me how it was a fitting metaphor for the Czech Republic, and indeed much of Europe. All over the country you have these beautiful, majestic remains of what had once been flourishing Christianity, cathedrals and chapels, incredible works of art, and yet, for the most part, today it is so devoid of real life, like these dry bones, beautiful but dead. And I began thinking of Ezekiel's vision of the Valley of Dry Bones in Ezekiel chapter 37. And he hears a voice that asks, "Can these bones live again?" And he responds, "Only you know, Lord." And God tells him to speak to the bones and command them to live again. And then the Spirit of God comes from all the four winds and raises up the bones and puts flesh and skin on them and then breathes new life into them. And I got to thinking about how amazing it would be to witness the Spirit of God come from all the four winds and breathe new life into all these dead bones, so to speak, across the Czech Republic. And I find myself yearning for that to happen now, yearning to see it happen and yearning to be a part of it. In John 4, he says, "Look, I tell you, lift up your eyes and see the fields are white for harvest." Are these dry, white bones part of the harvest that the Lord intends to bring about? In Matthew 9, Jesus says, "The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. So pray to the Lord of the harvest to send out workers." I believe I'm called to be a part of the answer to that prayer in the Czech Republic. And maybe God is calling you to join me as well. The longing for that harvest is what lights the fire in me. This was the message that I received so consistently from the very first time I arrived in the Czech Republic. There's so much to do and so few to do it. So pray that God sends laborers to this harvest, and pray about whether you might be called to participate somehow. Pray that God would breathe new life into the skeletons of dead religion, and pray that these bones would live again. So thank you for giving me this opportunity to share with you, and thanks for listening.